Throughout recent history, people have used psychological experiments to test theories of human thoughts, feelings, actions, and more. Today, we're going to be covering a few of those experiments. This is the second part of the psychological experiment Iceberg, so if you haven't checked out the first part, I'll make sure I link that below. Other than that, like, subscribe, comment, all that YouTube stuff, and we're just going to get right into it. Up first is MKUltra. MKUltra was a top-secret CIA project in which the agency conducted hundreds of clandestine experiments, sometimes on unwitting U.S. citizens, to assess the potential use of LSD and other drugs for mind control, information gathering, and psychological torture. Now, although Project MKUltra only lasted from 1953 until about 1973, details of the illicit program didn't become public until 1975, during a congressional investigation into the widespread illegal CIA activities within the United States and around the entire world. Okay, so to be honest, I do have a bigger video planned for MKUltra and actually for one other entry in this part of the iceberg. So for those, I'm just going to give like short little blurbs so you kind of get an idea of what it is, and then in the full video I'll break down everything having to do with them. So just so you know, I know this was a short one, but that's why, because I have a full video coming on it. So let's get to the next one. Up next is learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a psychological phenomenon in which a person learns that he or she cannot avoid bad things happening in the future. This then causes him or her to stop trying to prevent them from actually happening, and they just kind of expect bad things to happen. Learned helplessness is also often associated with depression. The first people to describe learned helplessness were the American psychologists Stephen F. Meyer and Martin E. P. Seligman. Now, Seligman conducted a series of classical experiments in the 1960s in which some dogs were placed in a chamber where they received electrical shock from which they could not escape. The dogs in the escape group could escape the shocks by pressing a panel with their nose. In the second phase, the animals were placed in a shuttle box divided by a barrier in the middle that the dogs could jump in order to escape the shocks. Only the dogs that had learned to escape in the previous phase, though, actually tried to jump. The other dogs did not even attempt to. In comparison, dogs who were previously allowed to escape the shocks tended to jump the partition and escape the pain. In the 1970s, Seligman extended the concept of learned helplessness from non-human animal research to clinical depression in humans and proposed the learned helplessness theory to explain how people become vulnerable to depression. According to this theory, people who are repeatedly exposed to stressful situations beyond their control develop an inability to make decisions or engage effectively in purposeful behavior. Subsequently, researchers have noticed that this learned helplessness theory is similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. Although the initial learned helplessness theory was considered to be an important breakthrough in its time, it soon came to be accepted that the theory needed further development to be applicable to humans, who are way more complex than other animals as it relates to our cognitive processes. Seligman and colleagues later reformulated the original learned helplessness model of depression that leads to the perception that one lacks control over negative outcomes are important in fostering a sense of learned helplessness. The logic of this model is that when an individual finds himself in a situation where something has either gone right or wrong, they will ask why. The answers that the person tends to give when asking themselves that kind of question will dictate whether that person defaults to an optimistic or a pessimistic explanatory style. Now, to be honest, I just figured we were kind of starting off on like a pretty sad one, you know what I mean? Learn helplessness, like you just learn that you can't actually ever be helped. So on the other side of that, there's also learned hopefulness. So I want to go over this real quick and then we'll get right back to the iceberg. Seligman himself believed that a more positive attributional style can be taught in order to overcome learned helplessness. Psychologists call this attribution style learned hopefulness. Learned hopefulness suggests that empowering experiences, ones that can provide opportunities to learn skills or develop a sense of control, can help individuals limit the debilitating and learned helplessness effects of barriers in their everyday lives. So in other words, just be optimistic and keep an eye out on the good things that happen to you. You know what I mean? Don't be so focused on the bad shit. But we're moving on to the next one. Up next is the Facebook experiments of 2012. For 1 week in 2012, Facebook altered the algorithms it uses to determine which status updates appeared in the newsfeed of 689,003 randomly selected users, or about 1 out of every 2,500 Facebook users. The results of this study were just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, or PNAS. Wow, that's pretty close to penis. That's fucked. As the authors explained, because people's friends frequently produce much more content than one person can view, Facebook ordinarily filters news content feeds via a ranking algorithm that Facebook continually develops and tests in the interest of showing viewers the content that they will find most relevant and most engaging. In this study, the algorithm filtered content based on its emotional content. A post was identified as either positive or negative if it used at least one word identified as positive or negative by a certain software. Some critics of the experiment have characterized it as one in which the researchers intentionally tried to make people sad. With the benefit of hindsight, they claim that the study merely tests the perfectly obvious proposition that reducing the amount of positive content in a user's newsfeed would cause that user to find more negative words and fewer positive words themselves and or to become less happy. But that's not what some prior studies would have predicted. Previous studies both in the US and in Germany had found that the largely positive, often self-promotional content that Facebook tends to feature has made users feel bitter and resentful, a phenomenon that the German researchers memorably call the self-promotional spiral or the envy spiral. Those studies would have predicted that reducing the positive content in a user's feed might actually make the users less sad. And it makes sense that Facebook would want to determine what will make users spend more time on its site rather than close the tab immediately and just move on to a different app or whatever they're going to go to. The study's first author, Adam Kramer of Facebook, confirmed that they did indeed want to investigate the theory that seeing friends' positive content makes users sad. To do so, the researchers conducted 2 experiments with a total of 4 groups of users, about 155,000 in each. In the first experiment, Facebook reduced the positive content of news feeds. Each positive post had between a 10 or 90% chance, based on their user ID, of being omitted from their news feed for that specific viewing. In the second experiment, Facebook reduced the negative content of news feeds in the same exact manner. In both experiments, these treatment conditions were compared with a control condition in which similar portions of posts were randomly filtered out, regardless whether it was negative or positive, doesn't matter. Now, it is important to note that whatever negative content that users were exposed to, they were actually from people that they were following, their own friends. They weren't coming from bots. They weren't made up fake. They were just basically being pushed out to them more frequently than they should have been actually, if that makes sense. So as long as you were writing something that Facebook's bot deemed negative, they were pushing that out to more people. So in the end, Facebook just being big scumbags, basically making people more depressed than they already are being on social media. So I would say that's a scummy move, even if it's only for a week or two, but whatever. Probably ruined at least 155,000 people's day at this point, you know what I mean? Especially if they had 2 groups of this people, so who knows, man. But we're moving on to the next one. Okay, up next is the Stanford prison experiments. Now, this is another entry that I already have a full video ready for. I'm basically just waiting until I drop this one and then I'm gonna put that one out. But I'm gonna give you guys a little blurb so you at least know what the video will be about or what the whole Stanford experiment is, you know what I mean? The Stanford Prison Experiments was a psychological experiment conducted in the summer of 1971. It was a 2-week simulation of a prison environment that examined the effects of situational variables on participants' reactions and behaviors. Stanford University's psychology professor Philip Zimbardo led the research team who administered the study. Participants were recruited from the local community with an ad in the newspaper offering $15 per day to male students who wanted to participate in a psychological study of prison life. Volunteers were chosen after assessments of psychological stability and then randomly assigned to being prisoners or prison guards. Those volunteers selected to be guards were given uniforms specifically to de-individuate them and instructed to prevent prisoners from escaping. The experiment officially started when prisoners were arrested by Rio Palo Alto police. Over the following 5 days, psychological abuse of the prisoners by the guards became increasingly brutal. And basically, you're gonna have to wait for the rest of the video, but that's the main gist of it. Just know it was supposed to be a 2-week experiment. Like I said, 5 days it lasted, so just get ready for that. Okay, up next is Little Albert. Ivan Pavlov showed that classical conditioning applied to animals, but did it also apply to humans? In a famous, though ethically dubious experiment, John Watson and Rocio Rayner showed that it did. At the outset of the study, Watson and Rayner encountered a 9-month-old baby named Little Albert, a remarkably fearless child scared only by loud noises. After gaining permission from Albert's mother, the researchers decided to test the process of classical conditioning on a human subject by inducing a further phobia into the child. Little Albert was a 9-month-old infant who was tested on his reactions to various neutral stimuli. He was shown a white rat, a rabbit, a monkey, and various masks. Albert, described as on the whole stolid and unemotional, showed no fear of any of these stimuli. However, what did startle him and cause him to become afraid was if a hammer was struck against a steel bar behind his head. Obviously, let's be real, that would freak the shit out of anybody. The sudden noise would cause Little Albert to burst into tears. After 7 pairings of the rat and noise in 2 sessions 1 week apart, Albert reacted with crying and avoidance when the rat was presented without the loud noise. So now little Albert only had to see the rat, and he immediately showed every sign of fear. He would cry whether or not the hammer was hit against the steel bar, and he would attempt to crawl away. This fear began to fade as time went on. However, the association could be renewed by repeating the original procedure a few times. Basically, they were just kind of torturing this kid. 5 days later, Watson and Rayner found that Albert developed phobias of objects which shared characteristics with the rat, including the family's dog, a fur coat, some cotton wool, and his father's Christmas mask. This process is known as generalization. The little Albert experiment demonstrated that classical conditioning could be used to create a phobia. A phobia is an irrational fear that is out of proportion to the danger. In this experiment, a previously unafraid baby was conditioned to become afraid of a rat. It also demonstrates two additional concepts originally outlined by Pavlov, the first being extinction. Although a conditioned association can be incredibly strong initially, it begins to fade if not reinforced until it disappears completely. And the second is generalization. Conditioned associations can often widen beyond the specific stimuli presented. For instance, if a child develops a negative association with one teacher, this association might also be made with other teachers. Over the next few weeks and months, little Albert was observed, and 10 days after conditioning, his fear of the rat was much less marked. However, even after a full month, it was still evident that the association could be renewed by repeating the original procedure a few more times. And unfortunately, Albert's mother withdrew him from the experiment the day the last tests were made, and Watson and Rayner were unable to conduct further experiments to reverse the conditional response. Okay, so I really wanted to figure out what actually happened to little Albert, so I did some more research, and this is basically what I found. Little Albert has been identified as Douglas Moretti, the son of a wet nurse named Arvilla Moretti, who lived and worked at the campus at the hospital at the time of the experiment, receiving about $1 for her baby's participation. Little Albert's fate and identity has been a recurring question among psychology scholars, including Appalachian State University psychologist Hall P. Beck, who, with a team of colleagues and students, sought answers. For 7 years, Beck and his associates scoured historical materials, conferred with facial recognition experts, met with relatives of the boy they theorized was Albert. Eventually, the pieces of the puzzle came together. The attributes of Douglas and his mother matched virtually everything that was known about Albert and his mother. Like Albert's mother, Douglas's mother worked at a pediatric hospital on campus called the Harriet Lane Home. Like Albert, Douglas was a white male who left the home in the early 1920s and was born at the same time of year as Albert. What's more, a comparison of a picture of Albert with Douglas's portrait revealed very similar facial similarities. Sadly, the team also discovered that Douglas died at age 6 of acquired hydrocephalus and was unable to determine if Douglas's fear of furry objects persisted after he had left Hopkins. So, RIP to Douglas or Albert, whatever you go by, RIP to you guys. Up next are the mother experiments. Harry Harlow was one of the first psychologists to scientifically investigate the nature of human love and affection. Through a series of controversial experiments, Harlow was able to demonstrate the importance of early attachments, affection, and emotional bonds on the course of healthy development. Harlow's experiments were often unethical and shockingly cruel, yet they uncovered fundamental truths that have influenced our understanding of child development. His most famous experiment involved giving young rhesus monkeys a choice between two different mothers. One was made of a soft terry cloth but provided no food. The other was made of wire but provided nourishment from an attached baby bottle. Harlow removed young monkeys from their natural mothers a few hours after birth and left them to be raised by these surrogate mothers. The experiment demonstrated that the baby monkeys spent significantly more time with their cloth mother than their wire mother, even though the wire mother gave them food and the other one provided basically nothing. In other words, the infant monkeys went to the wire mother only for food, but preferred to spend time with their soft, comforting cloth mother when they were not eating. Harlow concluded that affection was the primary force behind the need for closeness. Later research demonstrated that young monkeys would also turn to their cloth surrogate mother for comfort and security. Such work revealed that affectionate bonds were critical for development. Harlow utilized a strange situation technique, similar to the one created by researcher Mary Ainsworth. Young monkeys were allowed to explore a room either in the presence of their surrogate mother or in her absence. Monkeys who were with their cloth mother would use her as a secure base to explore the room. When the surrogate mothers were removed from the room, the effects were dramatic. The young monkeys no longer had this secure base for exploration and would often freeze up, crouch, rock, scream, and cry. Basically just completely freak out. Harlow's experiments offered irrefutable proof that love is vital for normal childhood development. Additional experiments by Harlow revealed that long-term devastation caused by deprivation, leading to profound psychological and emotional distress and even death after a while. Harlow's work, as well as important research by psychologists John Bodley and Mary Ainsworth, helped influence key changes in how orphanages, adoption agencies, social service groups, and child care providers approach the care of children. Now, although Harlow's work led to acclaim and generated a wealth of research on love, affection, and interpersonal relationships, his own personal life was filled with different issues. After the terminal illness of his wife, he became engulfed by alcoholism and depression. Eventually, he became estranged from his own children. Colleagues frequently describing him as sarcastic, mean-spirited, misanthropic, chauvinistic, and cruel. So basically, the guy was just an asshole and nobody really liked him at this point. Harlow's work was controversial in his own time and continues to draw on criticisms today. While such experiments present major ethical dilemmas, his work has helped inspire a shift in the way we think about children and development and helped researchers better understand both the nature and importance of love. So, I guess it's 50-50. He's an asshole, but I guess he helped out with some stuff, so whatever. Moving on to the last thing on this list, though, or this tier. Okay, and so for the final one, for the tip of the iceberg, we have the Milgram Experiments. One of the most famous studies of obedience in psychology was carried out by Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University. He conducted an experiment focusing on the conflict between obedience to authority and personal conscience. Milgram examined justifications for acts of genocide offered by those accused at the World War II Nuremberg war criminal trials. Their defense often was based on obedience, or they were just saying that they were following orders from their superiors. The experiments began in July 1961, a year after the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Milgram devised the experiment to answer the question, could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Can we call them all accomplices? Those are basically the questions he was trying to ask and get the answers to. Milgram wanted to investigate whether Germans were particularly obedient to authority figures, as this was a common explanation for the Nazi killings in World War II. Milgram selected participants for his experiment by newspaper advertising for male participants to take part in a study of learning at Yale University. The procedure was that the participant was paired with another person and they drew lots to find out who would be the learner and who would be the teacher. The draw was always fixed so that the participant was always the teacher and the learner was always one of Milgram's participants, so somebody that he chose specifically. The learner, who was our participant called Mr. Wallace, was taken into a room and had electrodes attached to his arms, and the teacher and researcher went into a room next door that contained an electrical shock generator and a row of switches marked from 15 volts, which was a slight shock, to 375 volts, dangerous severe shock, and all the way up to 450 volts, which was death basically. Milgram was interested in researching how far people would go in obeying an instruction if it involved harming another person. Milgram was interested in how easily ordinary people could be influenced into committing atrocities. Volunteers were recruited for a controlled experiment investigating learning, more so ethics and deception. Participants were 40 males aged from 20 to 50 whose jobs ranged from unskilled to professional from the New Haven area. They were paid $4.50 for just turning up. The learner, Mr. Wallace, was strapped to a chair with electrodes. After he has memorized a list of word pairs given to him to learn, the teacher tests him by naming a word and asking the learner to recall its partner or pair word from a list of 4 possible choices. The teacher is told to administer an electric shock every time the learner makes a mistake, increasing the level of shock each time. At this point, there were 30 switches on the shock generator, marked from 15 volts, slight shock, all the way up to 450 volts, which is dangerous severe shock, or death, basically, like I said before. The learner gave mainly wrong answers, all on purpose, and for each of these, the teacher gave him an electric shock. When the teacher refused to administer a shock, the experimenter was to give a series of orders or prods to ensure that they continued. In total, there were 4 prods, and if one was not obeyed, then the experimenter, Mr. Williams, read out the next prod, and so on. And the orders that were given to them is number 1, please continue. Number 2, the experiment requires you to continue. Number 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And number 4, you have no other choice but to continue. 65% or 2/3 of participants continued to the highest level of 450 volts. All the participants continued to at least 300 volts. Milgram did more than one experiment. He carried out 18 variations of this study. The individual explanation for the behavior of the participants would be that it was something about them as people that caused them to obey, but a more realistic explanation is that the situation they were in influenced them and caused them to behave in a way that they did. Some of the aspects of this situation may have influenced their behavior. Include the formality of the location, the behavior of the experimenter, and the fact that it was an experiment for which they had volunteered and been paid. Ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authoritative figure, even to the extent of killing an innocent human being. Obedience to authority is ingrained in all of us from the way that we're brought up. People tend to obey orders from other people if they recognize their authority as morally right and or legally based. This response to legitimate authority is learned in a variety of situations. For example, in this family, school, and the workplace. Milgram basically summed it up in the article The Perils of Obedience that he wrote in 1974, where he wrote, "The legal and philosophic aspects of obedience are of enormous import, but they say very little about how most people behave in concrete situations. I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subjects or participants, strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the subjects or participants' ears ringing in the screams of the victim's authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study and the fact most urgently demanding explanation." There were also a few ethical issues with this whole experiment, including the deception of the participants and the fact that they actually believed that they were shocking a real person and were unaware that the learner was just an associate of Milgram's. Also, the protection of the participants, since participants were exposed to extremely stressful situations that may have the potential to cause psychological harm. Many of the participants were even visibly distressed. Signs of tension included trembling, sweating, stuttering, laughing nervously, biting lips, and digging fingernails into the palms of their hands. 3 participants had uncontrollable seizures, and many pleaded to be allowed to stop the experiment. Milgram described a businessman that was reduced to a twitching, stuttering wreck. His exact words. And that is it for the tip of the iceberg. Next video, we're going to go a little bit deeper, one tier down, try to bust that whole thing out. Like I said, I do have a full solo video on the Stanford prison experiments coming, and I'm still working on the MK Ultra video, so that should be a little while away, but trust me, it's coming at some point. I do have something coming up for Halloween, and if you haven't checked out the first part of this, make sure you do that, because I'm about to just keep going until I finish this iceberg, and then we'll see. But if you got this far, appreciate you watching. Like, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff. Stay dangerous. This is a cold world out there, man. It's getting crazy. But anyways, stay dangerous. Love y'all, and I'll see you soon.